Hello, and welcome back to the Christian Century YouTube channel. I'm John, and I'm joined today by one of our writers, Marc Roscoe Loustau, who wrote a piece recently for us about chaplains serving in Ukraine, ministering to soldiers in the Ukrainian army. We are going to take a deeper dive into that article today. But first, just want to say hello to Marc. Welcome. Thanks for being here. Could you tell us, Marc, a little bit just about yourself and how you came to be in Ukraine writing this piece for us?
Yeah, well, thank you, John, and thanks to everybody at the Christian Century for this opportunity. Um, I made I'm trained as a cultural anthropologist and also as a theologian. I'm a lay preacher in the congregation that I attend here in the Boston area. And so I bring both of those backgrounds, both of that training, both of those identities into the pieces that I write, not only for anthropological journals, but also for the Christian Century. The first trip that I made to Ukraine was in 2016 for a conference. My ethnographic fieldwork for my dissertation was also in Eastern Europe. I spent 4 years living in Hungary and Romania. I've written some articles and a book about that experience. But I attended a conference and became good friends with some Ukrainian sociologists who also likewise bring a deep dedication, personal faith, personal commitment to Christian practice to their sociological research. And so we kept in touch, and including in the months and weeks leading up to the 2022 full-scale invasion. We were sending emails back and forth and just hoping for the best and really lamenting that the worst really did happen when Russia did invade and in 2022, and we've kept in touch since then. And it was based on those relationships and those personal connections that I first found my way to reporting in Ukraine.
Wow, thanks for sharing some of that background. So the piece begins, you're kind of setting the stage for the situation of chaplains in Ukraine right now by talking about a sort of a significant shift from a few years ago. You say that there had always been informal chaplaincy going on in the military there, but that a few years ago, President Zelensky formally, through legislation, established a chaplaincy program and modeled it after NATO's spiritual support program. I'm curious if you could just tell us a little more, like what's significant about this step that President Zelensky took? What is this NATO program that they're modeling it after? Just love to hear more about that.
And when chaplains back before the legislation, back before Zelensky sponsored this legislation and signed it into law, when chaplains were volunteers, they decided pretty much on their own where and when to go. They were kind of called and through their own personal relationship with God to minister to soldiers on the front line. During that kind of period of time of informal chaplaincy, you might call it, they had a lot of freedom to move in and out of military hotspots, the front lines, go back and forth, and kind of served both in their local congregations at home and then also on the front lines. But it also meant that they were unprotected and did not have like any official salary or pension or any rank in the military, any official rank in the military. So some chaplains, were in fact hired as in other jobs, just so they could kind of stick with one unit. A unit commander would hire them, for instance, as an accountant, so they could serve and stay with that military unit and provide spiritual support to the soldiers. The legislation kind of gave chaplains an official legal system of protections, a salary, mentioned a pension. They don't have to negotiate, for instance, with individual unit commanders for permission to minister to individual soldiers just simply to gain access. Now they also have, regular meetings with other chaplains for support and trainings. They have opportunities to meet chaplains from other traditions and even from their own tradition from other parts of the country. And so these are kind of things that they didn't have before the official legislation, before the kind of formalization of the chaplaincy program a few years ago. The
Wow.
details of kind of the NATO spiritual support system aren't kind of all that important in the article. It's a bit too in the weeds, I imagine, for a lot of the readers of the century. But the point that I'm kind of trying to make in the article about how Ukraine is modeling the chaplaincy after the NATO program is really to say that kind of is to make a point and to get into conversation with America's anti-imperialist Christian left, and to make the point that the anti-imperialist left really needs to kind of reevaluate its knee-jerk negative perception of NATO. A few months ago, in my congregation, like I said, I'm a lay preacher, and I gave a sermon about why we should support Ukraine. Afterwards, a member she's actually the chair of the social justice committee. She sent me an email rebuttal, and we've had dinners. I know her pretty well. We've had dinners and coffees together, and we've protested at the state house together and hosted local organizing meetings. So I really thought that kind of I knew her views pretty well. Um, and she told me in the email that Ukraine really should make a peace deal right now. And she also repeated some of Vladimir Putin's kind of most absurd claims, like, for instance, that Russia would not have invaded Ukraine had NATO not provoked Russia by threatening to expand eastward. So I was very surprised, to be completely honest. Then I remembered also that the anti-imperial left and the extreme right sometimes inadvertently and accidentally merge. They manage to find common cause. The far right and the far left do meet, although now it is still to my surprise that they seem to be meeting more often in Moscow. Um, the kind of the broader point that I wanted to make in my article was just to address those folks who are kind of anti-imperialists from a leftist Christian perspective, but and therefore have a kind of a deeply ingrained anti-NATO stance. I wanted to kind of help them see it from the Ukrainian perspective, why Ukrainian Christian leaders themselves are making a decision to ally themselves with NATO.
Hmm.
The article is something of an exercise in taking a few steps with Ukrainian Christian leaders in their own shoes, as it were, so that we might take a breath before we make a snap judgment about or against the direction and shape that the Ukrainian military chaplaincy is taking right now.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that, and thanks for adding that little story in. Some of our listeners who are clergy may have been a bit triggered hearing about an email rebuttal to a sermon,
Yeah.
but still,
uh,
that's helpful
yeah,
background
as
though.
they're called parking lot conversations, and I know that the dread that they provoke
Hmm. Yeah.
in many clergy.
Yeah. Well, okay. So you told us a little bit about the differences between being a volunteer chaplain and an official chaplain in the Ukrainian program, but I was kind of struck by in the article you talked to two specifically Protestant,
Mm.
Protestantism obviously in the minority in Ukraine. You talked to these two Protestant chaplains, one of whom was very established as an official military chaplain, and one who was choosing to remain in the flexible, informal kind of form of chaplaincy. And I was just curious, in your observation there, what do you think it is that draws certain clergy or ministers to join the official military chaplaincy program, whereas others are choosing to remain in this sort of informal role? What do you think is drawing different clergy to different roles?
I love that question. I mean, it really dives deep into the motivations that people bring to taking this, this really kind of fateful step, because you're signing a 5-year contract. This is no small decision to sign up as an official military chaplain now. Um, so I sort of imply in the article, I don't say it very explicitly, but I imply that the difference lies in their attitudes toward evangelization, at least in this particular contrast between Josip, the kind of evangelical slash Pentecostal pastor I met, and Anatoly, uh, the established, decade long um, uh, Baptist pastor and military chaplain. Um, and it's their attitudes toward frankly converting people to one particular approach to Christian faith. That's what I mean by evangelization. The Baptist pastor Anatoly said that the perspective that any prospective chaplain, if they take too dogmatic of an approach will crash out of the official military chaplaincy program. And he should know. I mean, he's been doing this for a decade. He's mentored many chaplains into the current program, which is really why I wanted to meet with him, because he has this kind of depth of experience. He, in the article and then also in our interview, he kind of represents the official position of the Ukrainian military chaplaincy. He did a very good job of explaining and articulating kind of some of the procedures, the official procedures, and the direction that the leadership wants to take the chaplaincy in. Although he did it with a lot of good humor, we had a lot of fun in the interview. He's a really hilarious guy. And I just, I mean, I enjoyed talking with all of the interview subjects for the article, but especially Anatoly. He made a lot of jokes. I could see why he's a very good mentor to a lot of people. So in these terms, we might see, my evangelical Pentecostal acquaintance Josip as too dogmatic in a way. Maybe he didn't sign up. He is a more informal chaplain. He chose that path, and maybe he didn't sign up to be a military chaplain because he didn't want people to tell him how to do his job, as how to do his business in a way. How to live out his calling is probably much more the language that he would use. He wanted to be true to his evangelical faith, and the military, I'm sure, would have forced him to be more like a secular doctor, which is really the model promoted by the kind of official trainings and documents of the Ukrainian military chaplaincy program. I didn't ask him explicitly, I have to say, why he chose not to join, but that's my sense about why he made the decision to kind of remain in the model of the informal chaplain. He himself did insist that he does not advocate for any single church, fine, but he also told me that his overarching goal is for Christians to hear the gospel, by which he means read the Bible, which is, of course, a very conservative evangelical Protestant approach to providing spiritual care. And he was definitely motivated by a sense of conversion is the fundamental act that matters, both in Ukraine, but then also broadly speaking, in the life of a Christian. But I think there are lots of reasons why any individual priest or pastor who's not interested in signing that 5-year contract would take kind of a flying leap and go to the front line. Including in the article, I write about this one Greek Catholic priest who seemed to be motivated by a sense of ethnic minority solidarity. He is a Hungarian speaker, part of the Hungarian minority, resident mostly in this one region called Transcarpathia, which is where I did my reporting from in Ukraine. And from Transcarpathia, there are nearly 400 Hungarian-speaking soldiers who have joined the military and are fighting on the front line. And he wanted to provide them with a sense of spiritual support from back home in their native language. And that, I think, was perhaps his overriding motivation for taking this one-off trip to the front line.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. Just one more question I wanted to ask you that relates to the very end of your article. You give kind of a, I don't know, intriguing to me kind of statement that folks here in the US maybe have a lot to learn from these Ukrainian chaplains. And you mentioned earlier a little bit of maybe some of what messages you'd like to convey to the far left in the US. But I'm curious if you could just give us a little more, like, what are these lessons that you think the church in the US maybe could gain from some of this interfaith or ecumenical work being done among the chaplains in Ukraine?
The details, it's hard to say practically on the ground what exactly we can learn. That I think, the stuff that we learn from people oftentimes is just particular to the relationships that we have. And so that'll really emerge over time in the practice of building relationships, both among Ukrainians in this ecumenical mode that you've mentioned, but then also between the American Christian left and Ukrainians themselves. And I sincerely hope that the first stages of building these kinds of relationships that have been going on now for, especially since 2022. I hope they continue. I hope we do continue to build relationships between the American Christian left and Ukrainian Christians. Um, I'd like my aspiration, my hope here is that we see kind of an addition to the habitual ways that we've developed to relate to Ukrainian Christians following the 2022 invasion. Initially the thrust was really all about providing humanitarian aid and certainly military aid as well, and both of those are very important. But I think it's dug us as the American progressive Christian left. It's dug us into a rather paternalistic donor recipient rut for these relationships. And that's unfortunately, I think, prevented American progressive Christians from adopting maybe more of an attitude of more of a humble attitude, an attitude of kind of ethical and political and especially theological and intellectual humility. The anti-imperial left, I think, has had a hard time believing that we can learn from Ukraine's own leftist movement. And I think the American Christian left has perhaps also had a hard time thinking that we can, in all humility, learn from Ukrainian progressive Christians. And certainly the Ukrainian left has its own anti-imperial argument for actively resisting Russia's invasion, Russia's very imperialistic invasion. And because we're not quite willing to put ourselves in the position of learning from Ukrainians themselves, it's been easier, at least, to stick with our own comfortable positions against NATO, our own comfortable anti-imperialism. So, that's one of the ways that I think we can sort of shock ourselves out of our typical understandings. And one of the things that we can perhaps gain from being in a more humble relationship with Ukrainians. And now, American progressives now can take steps to, I think, get into this attitude of humility to accompany Ukrainians in the next steps after the war is won. I think it's very important to stay in these relationships that we've created now and are creating in these early days, because it is still early days and hopefully the war will end soon, but it doesn't seem to be ending very soon. So we need to stay in those relationships and perhaps to cultivate more of an attitude of humility, hopefully going forward. That's what I would love to see.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Well, a lot to think about. Thank you, both for this conversation and for this really informative article. Anyone out there who missed this piece, there will be several links below that you might want to check out. Click below to read this particular article from Marc. Also, there'll be a link to all the other pieces Marc has written for the Christian Century. And we'll also have a link below to Marc's website where you can see other work and other writings that he has done. Thanks so much for joining us today, Marc.
Thank you, John.